The morning Nadine Burrell got the call about her uncle's estate, she was standing at the kitchen sink in bare feet, watching the last of the dish soap dissolve into gray water. The window above the sink looked out over the parking lot of the apartment complex, and in the pale, flat light of a Tuesday in November, everything beyond the glass looked exactly as tired as she felt. A pickup truck with one broken tail light sat crooked in the third space. A shopping cart had come to rest against the chain-link fence at the far end of the lot, as if it had simply given up on going anywhere. She could relate to that. The phone rang twice before she picked it up, and she almost did not answer. Unknown numbers rarely brought good news, and she had learned in the past 2 years to approach the phone the way you approach a dog you have never met before, carefully, with a hand open rather than a fist. The voice on the other end belonged to a man who introduced himself as Martin Levy, an attorney with offices in the town of Crestford, about 90 miles east. He spoke with the practiced calm of someone who delivered complicated news for a living, and he got to the point before she had finished drying her hands on the dish towel. Her uncle, Roy Burrell, had passed away 11 days ago. She had not known. That was the first thing that settled into her, heavy and quiet, like water filling a space you had not realized was hollow. Roy had been her father's older brother, and after her father died 8 years ago, Roy had become a kind of distant presence in her life, not absent, but not close either. A man who sent Christmas cards with handwritten notes that were always a little too formal, who called on birthdays and spoke for exactly 12 minutes before finding a reason to hang up. She had liked him in the way you like a word you do not know how to use, fondly and from a distance. He had died alone. The attorney said it gently, but the word alone still had a particular weight to it that Nadine felt in her chest. He had lived in the same house in Crestford for the last 22 years, a small craftsman-style bungalow on the edge of a quiet street. And when his neighbor had noticed the lights had not changed in 3 days, they had called the county. Roy had been 71 years old and had left no surviving spouse, no children, and no will that the attorney had been able to locate. For what he had left was a house, a modest car, a checking account with a balance that the attorney described as limited, and the contents of the house itself, which by law would pass to the nearest living relative. Nadine was the nearest living relative. She stood in her kitchen in her bare feet with the dish towel still in her hand, and she felt the particular vertigo of the world offering you something you had not asked for. She said she would come. She set down the phone and looked at the parking lot again. The shopping cart had not moved. She did not tell her daughters right away. Maya was 15 and Cecily was 11, and both of them had a way of reading her silences that she had always found unsettling and beautiful in equal measure. She knew they would ask questions she did not yet have answers to, and she needed a few hours to carry the news alone before it became something shared. She sat at the kitchen table after the girls had gone to school and spread out the month's bills the way a doctor lays out an X-ray. Flat, organized, requiring an honest look. The electric bill was manageable. The car payment was not. 3 months ago, her hours at the hotel housekeeping department had been cut from full-time to 4 days a week, and the difference between what she earned and what she owed had become a gap she crossed every month on a bridge made of luck and delayed payments and the occasional overdraft. She had not been evicted yet. She repeated this to herself sometimes as a form of reassurance, which was not the same as comfort, but was the best she could manage. She had not been evicted yet, and she had applied for a second job at a grocery distribution center and was waiting to hear back. She had sold her grandmother's jewelry 18 months ago, a decision she had made in a single cold afternoon and had not allowed herself to second-guess since. She had borrowed $300 from her friend Deanna, who had given it without asking for anything in return, which had made it both easier and harder to accept. She was not a woman who expected the world to solve her problems. She had never been that kind of woman. Her mother had worked 2 jobs for most of Nadine's childhood and had treated self-pity with something close to contempt, the way you might treat an uninvited guest who kept coming back. Nadine had inherited that quality, more or less. She kept her head down. She kept moving. She believed that if you worked hard enough and long enough, the math would eventually balance. But the math had been stubborn lately. The math had been resistant to belief. So when the attorney mentioned the house in Crestford, she heard it the way a person standing in a burning room hears the word exit. Not with excitement, with focus, with the particular attention of someone who has been looking for a way out. She drove to Crestford on a Saturday, leaving the girls with Deanna, who had offered without being asked. The highway east was flat and familiar in the way that roads you have never traveled can still feel familiar, because the landscape does not change much. The sky does not change. The particular way that November drains the color from fields and tree lines remains consistent for hundreds of miles in any direction. She found the house without difficulty. It was on a street called Meridian, lined with mature elms that had dropped most of their leaves, and it sat back from the road, behind a short, concrete path that had heaved in several places from years of frost and thaw. The house itself was gray with white trim, smaller than she had imagined, with a front porch that sagged slightly at one corner and a garden bed along the front that had gone entirely to seed. It did not look like a place that held anything of particular value. It looked like a place that had been loved in a quiet, unpracticed way, the kind of love that keeps the roof in good repair but forgets about the garden. Martin Levy was already there when she arrived. He was a thin man in his mid-50s, with reading glasses perched on his forehead and the distracted manner of someone perpetually behind on his schedule. He handed her the key without ceremony and walked her through the paperwork on the porch because the front steps were solid, at least, even if the rest needed attention. He told her the probate process would take a few months to finalize, but that she was free to come and go as she pleased and to begin sorting through the contents. When she stepped inside for the first time, she paused just past the threshold and stood still for a moment. The way you stand when you walk into a church or a library, when the quality of the silence is different from ordinary silence. The house smelled of old paper and something faintly sweet, maybe cedar, for when the afternoon light came through the front windows in long yellow bars that picked up dust in the air. Everything was very clean, which surprised her. She had half expected neglect, the accumulating disorder of a man living alone, but Roy had apparently been a careful keeper of spaces. The furniture was modest, a blue corduroy sofa, a recliner the color of wheat, a television that was older than her youngest daughter. Books arranged on shelves not alphabetically, but by size, which told her something about Roy she had never known. He was a man who valued appearance over system, or perhaps he had simply not thought too hard about it. She could not be sure which. She moved through the house slowly, her hands in her jacket pockets, not yet touching anything. The kitchen was small and clean. A coffee maker that would have been new in the early 2000s. A calendar on the wall from the previous year, open to March, with a few appointments noted in small, careful handwriting. A dentist. A library book, due date. A notation that said, simply Salingio, with a question mark beside it, that she would spend several minutes turning over in her mind before letting it go. The bedrooms were 2 in number. One was clearly Roy's, the bed neatly made with a plaid comforter, a single nightstand holding a reading lamp and a paperback mystery face down at the halfway point, as if he had expected to come back to it. The other had been used as a study or a storage room or some combination of both. Boxes were stacked along one wall, labeled in that same small handwriting. Tax records, hardware, photographs. The word photographs caught her eye, but she did not open that box yet. She was not sure what she was looking for. She told herself she was simply taking stock, which was true, But it was also true that she was looking for the thing that would make this worthwhile. The piece of the equation that would make the math work. She was practical enough not to feel ashamed of that. She had 2 daughters and a car payment and a gap that did not care about grief. She found the filing cabinet almost as an afterthought. It was in the corner of the study, behind a stack of boxes and partially obscured by a raincoat hanging from a hook on the wall. It was a 4-drawer steel filing cabinet, the kind you see in offices from a certain era, painted a dark olive green that had faded unevenly, so that the top was lighter than the bottom, or the places where hands had touched it over the years, showing as slight brightnesses in the dull paint. It was large, heavy. She could tell just from looking at it, the kind of heavy that makes a floor groan when you move it. 3 of the 4 drawers had small metal labels in their holders. Top drawer, correspondence. 2nd drawer, financial. 3rd drawer, personal. The 4th drawer, the bottom one, had no label, and it had a lock. She tried the upper drawers first. They opened without resistance, the runners slow but functional, the kind of slowness that comes from age rather than damage. The 1st drawer was full of hanging folders, neatly tabbed, filled with papers that she did not examine closely yet. Letters, printed emails, which struck her as the habit of a man who did not entirely trust the digital world to hold things safely. On a few manila envelopes, sealed and dated in that small handwriting. The 2nd drawer held what you would expect: bank statements going back a decade, tax returns in their own labeled folders, an insurance policy, a vehicle title, nothing that suggested hidden wealth. The account statements showed a man who had lived within his means and not much beyond them. The 3rd drawer held the things that felt private in a way the others did not. A collection of photographs loose rather than in albums. Several journals, small and spiral-bound, their covers soft from handling. A bundle of letters tied with twine that she recognized immediately because the handwriting on the envelopes was her father's. She did not open those either. Not yet. She set them gently back in the drawer and eased it shut. Then she tried the bottom drawer. It did not move. She tried it again, pulling with both hands, thinking perhaps it was simply stiff, that the runners had seized from disuse. But the resistance was different from stiffness. There was a small, deliberate lock in the center of the drawer face, a cylinder lock with a keyhole, and the mechanism was engaged. Someone had locked this drawer and locked it with intention. She stepped back and looked at the cabinet for a long moment. The raincoat on the hook beside it swayed slightly from her movement, and then went still. She had found no key in the course of her walk through the house. She made a mental note to look more carefully. She came back the following weekend with Maya and Cecily, who had insisted on coming after she described the house in vague terms over dinner one evening. She had not mentioned the filing cabinet. She had said only that there were boxes to sort through, and that she could use the help. The girls took to the house with the easy curiosity of the young, moving from room to room and reporting their findings like small explorers. Maya discovered the paperback mystery on the nightstand and spent 20 minutes reading the back cover and the first 2 pages with the serious expression she reserved for things she was deciding whether to care about. Cecily found a tin of hard candies in the kitchen cupboard and ate 3 of them before Nadine suggested that was enough, and then ate 1 more with the pragmatic defiance that was characteristic of her approach to most boundaries. Nadine's sister-in-law, Patricia, had come with them. Patricia was married to Nadine's brother, Kevin, who could not take the weekend off but had suggested Patricia go in his place, which was either generosity or avoidance, depending on how well you knew Kevin. Patricia was a woman who arrived at opinions quickly and held them with the confidence of someone who had never been seriously wrong, or at least had never noticed when she was. She walked through the house with her arms crossed and her eyes moving at the speed of appraisal. She picked up the coffee maker and turned it over. She pressed on the sofa cushions. She opened the kitchen cabinets with the focused interest of someone calculating resale value, which was, Nadine suspected, precisely what she was doing. When she saw the filing cabinet, she stopped. "What is this?" Patricia said, though her tone suggested she already knew. "A filing cabinet," Nadine said. "So, no, I can see that." Patricia tried the top drawer, then the second. She flipped through a few of the folders, not reading them but measuring them, the way you fan through a deck of cards to confirm it is complete. She tried the bottom drawer, felt the lock, and made a sound in the back of her throat. "Locked," she said. "I noticed. What do you think is in it?" "I don't know. I haven't been able to open it." Patricia stepped back and looked at the cabinet with her head slightly tilted. "Kevin should have this," she said. It was the tone she used when she was presenting a conclusion, as if it were a fact, as if the thought had simply materialized complete and self-evident, rather than been decided. "Kevin is Roy's nephew the same as I am," Nadine said. "Roy's niece, I mean. We're the same relation." "Kevin is older," Patricia said, so as if seniority of birth conveyed a kind of inheritance of furniture. "That's not how estates work," Patricia looked at her. "I just mean that Kevin would know what to do with something like this. He has the office space for it. He has the storage. I have 2 daughters who could use the financial help that anything in this house might provide." The words came out more directly than she had planned, and there was a brief silence in which Patricia recalibrated. She was not a cruel woman, Nadine knew. She was simply a woman for whom fairness meant something different from equity. Fairness for Patricia meant the loudest voice or the first hand raised. "It's just an old filing cabinet," Patricia said finally. Her voice had shifted into something lighter, slightly dismissive. "Well, probably nothing in it but more bank statements and paperwork. Roy wasn't exactly a wealthy man." "No," Nadine agreed. "He wasn't. I just think Kevin should have something. He drove Roy to the hospital twice last year. Did you know that?" "Twice? I didn't know that. I'm just saying, there are different kinds of claim." Nadine looked at the cabinet and then at Patricia, and she felt the particular exhaustion of conversations that dress practicality in the clothing of principle. "When the estate is finalized," she said, keeping her voice even, "I'll make sure Kevin is part of whatever is distributed. But right now, legally, everything here comes to me." That's what the attorney said. Patricia nodded once, the nod of a woman agreeing temporarily, while reserving the right to revisit the subject. And she spent the rest of the afternoon in a state of friendly industry, helping to sort boxes and carry bags and organize the kitchen, and she did not mention the filing cabinet again that day. She mentioned it 3 days later, during a call with Kevin that Nadine had not initiated. Kevin was a reasonable man most of the time, but he had a way of arriving at his opinions through Patricia, which meant they were often Patricia's opinions polished and presented in a lower register. "I hear there's an old filing cabinet," he said. "There is," Nadine said. "Locked drawer? Bottom drawer. I'm looking for the key." "What do you think is in it?" "I don't know yet." "Probably nothing," Kevin said, in a way that sounded like he was trying to convince himself rather than her. "Roy didn't have much. He was a simple guy." "He was." "Patricia thinks you might as well just leave it. You know, with the house when it sells. Some buyer might want the furniture." Nadine held the phone and looked at the wall. Outside, the sound of Cecily practicing the recorder drifted down the hallway. The same 4 notes repeated in slightly different orders, like a code being tested. "I'm not leaving it," she said. There was a pause. "I'm not saying you have to," Kevin said carefully. "I'm just saying, you know, it's a lot of effort for an old cabinet. Could be nothing. Could be. What would you even do with it? It's heavy. Those things weigh a ton. I'll figure it out." Another pause. "You know, some guys at my work have a joke about things like this. You know what they call it?" He laughed a little, setting it up for himself. "They call it poor man's logic. Like spending $300 in truck rental to move a $200 piece of furniture just because it's yours. She smiled, because Kevin meant it as a joke rather than an insult, and because she knew the difference, even when the result was the same. If it turns out to be nothing, she said, you can tell me I told you so. Deal, he said, and they ended the call on the easy terms of people who disagreed without hostility. She did not tell him that she had spent 2 nights since her first visit to the house thinking about the locked drawer. She did not tell him that she had gone through every description she could find online for that particular model of filing cabinet, that she had looked up locksmiths in Crestford and found one who quoted her $60 to open a cylinder lock, and that she had been saving that $60 in an envelope on the kitchen counter like a small, private act of faith. She hired a neighbor's teenage son and his friend to help her load the cabinet into a borrowed pickup truck on a cold Saturday in early December. The boys were 16 and large, and treated the whole enterprise with the cheerful indifference of people who have not yet learned to find anything absurd. They loaded the cabinet with the efficient grace of youth, as if weight were simply a variable to be managed rather than an obstacle to be overcome. Her brother's friend Marcus, who had agreed to lend the truck, watched from the driveway with his hands in his pockets and a mild expression that she recognized as the face of a man who had already formulated an opinion but was not sure whether he was wanted to share it. "You're moving that all the way back?" he said finally. "I am," she said. "That's a 3-hour drive." "I know how far it is," he nodded slowly. "Kevin said you found some old cabinet, said the drawer was locked." "That's right." Marcus looked at the cabinet in the truck bed. The green paint faded, the metal scuffed at the corners, from decades of being pushed against walls and slid along floors. It looked, she could see the thought forming in his face, like exactly what it was. Old office furniture, heavy and unremarkable, the kind of thing that accumulated in the back rooms of businesses and eventually got dragged to the curb. "Probably just old papers," Marcus said. "Probably," she agreed. Roy wasn't the kind of guy to have, you know. He searched for the word. "Surprises?" She smiled. "Maybe not," she said. She went back to checking the straps. She set the filing cabinet in the corner of her bedroom because the apartment was not large, and there was nowhere else with enough floor space, and because she was not ready to put it somewhere she could not see it. The boys who had helped her load, it helped her unload it, their willingness to do so unconditional and slightly charming. And after they left, she stood in the doorway of her bedroom and looked at it for a while. It looked wrong in the room, incongruous. The olive green paint against the pale yellow of her walls, the industrial angles against the soft disorder of her everyday life. It looked like an object from a different world that had been placed here temporarily, waiting to be sent on to wherever it actually belonged. But it was here now, and when she was going to find out what was in it. She opened the top 3 drawers again that evening, taking her time. She went through the folders in the first drawer carefully, reading labels, setting aside anything that seemed potentially significant. She found a small spiral notebook wedged at the back of the correspondence drawer that she had missed on her first pass, its cover worn and its pages dense with that small handwriting. She did not read it yet. She set it on her nightstand, where it sat beside the water glass and the lamp and the 3 library books she had not had time to return. She found no key. She looked in every envelope, in every folder. She checked the back of every folder for anything taped or tucked. She went through the personal drawer again more slowly, and when she reached the bundle of letters in her father's handwriting, she sat on the edge of the bed for a long time before she opened the first one. It was dated 14 years ago, and it was brief. Her father's handwriting had always looked to her like a man trying to be neater than his natural impulse. The letters slightly too careful, the lines slightly too straight, as if he were working against his own hand. The letter was about money. Specifically, it was about a loan. Her father was asking Roy for help. He had a problem he described only as a situation, and he needed $3,000. And he would understand completely if Roy said no, he just needed to ask. She sat with that for a while. She had not known about this. She had been 23 when the letter was dated, already living independently, already deep into the working life that had defined everything since. She had not known her father needed money, though she thought back and recognized, dimly, that the period around that time had been tight in ways she had noticed without fully understanding. She opened the second letter. Roy had written back. He had sent the money. He had said something in the letter that she read twice, and then a third time, sitting very still on the edge of her bed with the paper in both hands. He had said, "Do not worry about paying it back. I want you to put it toward the girls if you can. The 3 younger ones especially. I know Nadine will be fine. She always figures it out. But the younger ones could use a head start." She set the letter down carefully on her knee. She always figures it out. There was something about the confidence in that sentence that moved through her slowly, like warm water. Her uncle had believed this about her without telling her, had held it as a settled fact, had said it to her father as if it required no defense or explanation, as obvious as the date or the weather. She had not known that Roy had thought of her this way. She had not known how much she needed to hear it until she was sitting in her bedroom at 41 years old, reading it in the handwriting of a man who would not call for exactly 12 minutes anymore, who was gone now without warning. She placed the letters back in their bundle and put them on the nightstand beside the notebook. She closed the third drawer softly. She looked at the bottom drawer for a long moment. The lock was small and silver against the faded green paint. The keyhole was a simple oval. Somewhere, a key existed that would open this, or a locksmith's tool would do the same. She had the $60 in the envelope on the kitchen counter. She was not going to need it, as it turned out. She found the key on a Wednesday evening, 3 weeks after she had brought the cabinet home, in the place she had not thought to look because it was both too obvious and too private. She had been reading the small spiral notebook from the correspondence drawer, working through it slowly over several nights, Roy's handwriting dense with observations and lists and occasional longer passages that she recognized as the kind of writing a person does when they have no one to talk to, but still need to think out loud. The notebook was full of ordinary things, grocery lists, notes from doctor's appointments, so reminders to call various people, most of whom she did not know. Weather observations, a passage about a walk he had taken in late summer when the light had been particularly good on the street where he lived. A passage about missing her father, written 6 months after the funeral. That was only 3 sentences long, but each sentence precise and clean, like 3 nails driven straight. And on one of the last pages used, amid a list of tasks he had apparently written for himself on a particular October morning, she found it. Third item down, a reminder to himself, written in that small, careful hand, that read simply, "Key, right side panel." She looked up from the notebook. Then she got up from the bed and crossed the room to the filing cabinet and crouched in front of it and ran her fingers along the right side panel. Near the bottom, below the last drawer, the panel was slightly proud of the frame in one spot, barely perceptible, just enough to feel if you were looking for it. She pressed, and something gave, and a thin strip of metal came loose in her hand. Behind it, in a small indentation cut into the panel, was a key. She held it up. It was a small, brass-colored key, the kind you see on lockboxes and filing cabinets. Nothing distinctive about it except that it existed, and she had found it, and the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet was 3 inches from her hand. She sat back on her heels and looked at the key in her palm. She thought about Maya and Cecily, who were asleep down the hall. She thought about the envelope with the $60 that she no longer needed for a locksmith, and whether she should put it toward the electric bill or save it against whatever came next. She thought about Roy, who had believed she would always figure it out, who had written a letter that she would not read for 14 years, and who had left her this cabinet and everything in it without being able to tell her why. The apartment was quiet. Beyond the window, the parking lot held its ordinary shapes, the truck with the broken tail light, the empty spaces where no one had come home yet. The cold had settled in for real now, the kind that stays, and the radiator along the far wall ticked and hissed in the familiar rhythm of not quite enough heat. She looked at the key again. Then she looked at the lock. She reached out and fit the key to the cylinder, and it slid in without resistance, on the way keys do when they belong exactly where you are putting them, and she felt the mechanism turn. She did not open the drawer yet. She knelt there with her hand on the key, turned in the lock, and she let herself stay in the moment just before knowing. She had lived most of her life in the practical present tense, moving from what was to what needed to be done, not often stopping in the space between. But this moment had a quality she did not want to pass through too quickly. Whatever was in this drawer had been locked by a man she had underestimated, in a house she had almost not bothered to visit, in a life that had more in it than 12-minute phone calls had suggested. She thought about the sentence in the letter. She always figures it out. Then she wrapped her hand around the drawer handle and she pulled it open. The drawer moved slowly, the runners stiff from years of disuse, the frame carrying the weight of something denser than paper. She leaned forward as it came open, and in the dim light of her bedroom on a Wednesday night in December, she saw what was inside. The drawer was full. Not full the way the other drawers were full, with the expected accumulation of a life organized by category. Full in a different way. Full in a way that made her exhale without deciding to. Full with something she had not expected to find in an old filing cabinet in the corner of her bedroom, in an apartment she could barely afford, on a night when the parking lot was quiet and the girls were asleep, and the only sound was the radiator and the distant hum of traffic on the highway 2 streets over. She stared. She did not move for a long moment, for her hand was still on the drawer handle. Her knees were on the floor. The light from the bedside lamp fell across the open drawer and what it contained, and the shadows it made were very specific, very deliberate, the kind of shadows cast by objects with weight and presence and meaning. She reached in and touched the top of the nearest item with one finger, very carefully, the way you touch something to confirm it is real, to confirm that the signal you are receiving is honest. It was real. She sat back slowly on her heels, and the key was still in the lock, and her heart was doing something she had not given it permission to do, and the apartment was very quiet, and the drawer was open. She looked at it for a long time without speaking, because there was no one to speak to, and because she was not yet sure what to say. And she had been expecting more files, more of the same careful organization that defined everything else in the cabinet, the tabbed folders and the labeled envelopes, and the ordered logic of a man who filed his grocery receipts. She had expected that the locked drawer meant privacy rather than significance. Personal documents, perhaps. Old medical records he had not wanted visible. Sentimental papers of no particular monetary value. She had told herself, in the 3 weeks since finding the cabinet, and the weeks before that spent looking for the key, that she was not expecting anything remarkable. She had told herself this with some conviction, because she believed it was important to protect yourself against hoping too hard. She had not entirely believed it, though. She did not reach in again immediately. She sat back on her heels and studied what she could see from the angle she was at. The drawer was deep, the way bottom drawers are, and what filled it was arranged with the same care that characterized everything else Roy had kept. Nothing was thrown in loosely. Nothing was crumpled or bent. Whatever this was, he had treated it with the same deliberate attention he had given to the letters and the tax returns and the photographs of people he loved. The item she had touched first was a flat, rigid case, dark, some kind of protective housing, with a latch on the front that had the particular look of something designed to seal out moisture and air. She had seen cases like it before, in a different context, at an estate sale she had attended with Deanna 2 years ago, where someone's father had left behind a collection of things that the family had not known how to value. The dealer who had been there that day had used a similar case, and she remembered thinking at the time that it was the kind of container you used when you wanted something to last. Behind the first case, she could see the edges of more of them, 3, perhaps 4, and beside them, something wrapped in cloth, the fabric dark with age but intact, tied neatly with a strip of the same material, the way her grandmother had wrapped her good silverware. And beneath everything else, visible only at the far back of the drawer, where the light from the lamp barely reached, a large envelope, brown and sealed, with something written on the outside in small, careful handwriting that she recognized immediately. She leaned forward to read it. It was her name. Nadine. Just that. One word in the center of the envelope, written as deliberately as if it had been placed there years ago against the possibility of this exact moment. As if Roy had understood that she would be here, on the floor of her bedroom on some quiet night in the future, her hand on the handle of this drawer, needing to know that what she found had been left for her. She sat there for another long moment, her knees beginning to ache against the hardwood floor, her breath steady and shallow. The key still turned in the lock, and the drawer pulled open, and the world outside the apartment windows going about its ordinary business, entirely unaware that something had shifted in this particular corner of it. She thought again about the letter. She always figures it out. Roy had believed that. He had believed it enough to write it down. And he had left this for her, locked it and hidden the key, and arranged everything inside with the patience of a man who intended his decisions to survive him. She reached in and lifted the first case out of the drawer, and she set it carefully on the floor beside her. Then she lifted the second, then the third. Her hands were steady, which surprised her. She felt the weight of each one, real and substantial, and she set them in a row on the floor as if she were following instructions she could not yet read. Then she reached back into the drawer and lifted out the wrapped object, and then, last, the envelope with her name on it. She held it for a moment, just held it, feeling the slight stiffness of whatever was folded inside. And then she set it on the floor in front of her and looked at everything she had laid out. The cases, the wrapped cloth, the envelope, the locked drawer, now empty and open, the key, the lamp, the quiet apartment, the sleeping girls down the hall. She picked up the envelope and she opened it. The letter inside was 3 pages, handwritten on the same cream-colored paper Roy had used for the letters she had found, bundled in the third drawer. The handwriting was smaller than usual, as if he had been rationing space deliberately, every word placed with the care of someone who understood. He would not be there to explain himself afterward. She read it on the floor of her bedroom with her back against the side of the bed and her legs crossed, and the protective cases arranged in a row beside her, patient and sealed. The lamp threw a warm circle of light. Down the hall, one of the girls shifted in sleep, and the old radiator along the wall spoke in its language of ticks and sighs, and outside the city went on in its muted, late-night way. She read the letter twice before she trusted herself to understand what it was saying. Roy had begun working for a man named Arthur Voss in 1987. He had been 40 years old, and between things, which was how he described it, between a job that had ended badly and a sense of purpose that had not yet arrived. Arthur Voss was a collector, not a hobbyist, not a dilettante with an appreciation for pretty things. A collector in the systematic, obsessive, decades-long sense of the word, a man who had spent the better part of his adult life acquiring philatelic material, which was what Roy wrote, using the word carefully, as if he had learned it late in life and wanted to deploy it correctly. Stamps. Arthur Voss collected stamps. She paused on that, feeling the particular puncture of the unexpected ordinary. Stamps. She pressed on. Voss had been well connected in the philatelic world, which was apparently a world with its own institutions, its own hierarchy, its own quietly ferocious competitions over objects that most people would pass over without a second glance. He had built his collection over 40 years, acquiring pieces through dealers, auctions, estate sales, private transactions, traveling to Europe twice a year, and to Asia every third year in pursuit of specific items he had been tracking for decades. Roy had worked for him as a general assistant, then as a cataloger, then as what Voss called his archivist, meaning the person responsible for keeping the collection documented, secure, and organized. He had done this work for 19 years. Roy wrote about Voss with a restrained affection that was clearly the product of long familiarity rather than uncomplicated admiration. The man had been exacting, difficult to satisfy, and constitutionally unable to explain why certain things mattered to him as much as they did. But he had also been fair in his fashion. He had paid Roy well. He had trusted him with things that a lesser man would have kept to himself, and he had treated the collection as something that deserved to outlast him, which was how Roy came to understand that Voss was thinking, even in his 60s, about what happened to everything he had gathered after he was gone. Voss died in 2006 without surviving family. His will, Roy wrote, had been a complicated document that had taken 2 years to resolve through the courts. The primary estate had passed to a charitable foundation he had established for the purpose. The house had been sold. The investments had been distributed according to his instructions. The collection had not been part of the will. Roy had paused in his writing here, or she imagined he had, because the next few lines were slightly more deliberate than the ones before them, as if he were choosing not the words to express a thought, but the thought to express. Before he died, Voss had told Roy that the collection was his, not in those words, not through a legal instrument, but in the way that certain things are conveyed between people who trust each other entirely and do not feel the need for formality to confirm what they already know. For he had said, "Roy, when I'm gone, you take what we've been keeping. You'll know what to do with it." Roy had taken that as the instruction it was intended to be, not out of greed or opportunism, but out of respect for what Voss had wanted. The collection had been the central work of Voss's life. It deserved a custodian who understood its value. Roy was the only person alive who did. He had taken the collection to his house in Crestford in 2006, and he had kept it there for the 18 years between Voss's death and his own. He had not sold any of it. He had not shown it to anyone. He had told no one it existed, not because he was ashamed of possessing it, but because he understood that the moment the world knew about it, the world would have opinions about what should be done with it, and he was not yet sure what the right thing was. He had spent 18 years being not yet sure. This was not presented as a failure in the letter. It was presented as honesty about a question he had found genuinely difficult. And then, near the end of those 18 years, he had decided. The collection was hers, not Kevin's, not the charitable foundation, not the philatelic societies that would have paid handsomely for the privilege of cataloging it. Hers, because of the sentence he had written to her father 14 years ago. Because she always figures it out. Because he had watched her, from a distance measured in 12-minute phone calls, handle the kind of sustained difficulty that would have broken people with more advantages, and he had decided that whatever the collection represented, it should go to the person most likely to use it towards something real. Though he did not know exactly what the collection was worth at current market values. He knew what it had been worth in the early 2000s, and he knew that certain categories of what Voss had assembled had only become more valuable since then. He knew that 2 items in the third case were, to his knowledge, unique in the world. He had tried to describe in the letter what she would find and what she should know before she contacted anyone about it, and he had included at the back of the letter a handwritten list of the case's contents, cross-referenced to the number printed on each case's latch. He had also written the names of 2 dealers and 1 auction house that he considered both reputable and knowledgeable enough to evaluate what she had. He did not know if these firms were still operating. The letter had been written 2 years before his death. He had wanted to write it before his health made the task difficult. He had signed it the same way he signed his Christmas cards, with care and with the particular formality of a man who took his feelings seriously and expressed them from a distance. Your uncle, Roy. She sat with the letter for a long time after she finished the second reading. The floor was cold beneath her, and her back had begun to ache from the angle, and she was aware of all of this in a distracted, peripheral way. The way you are aware of the weather when you are reading something that requires your full attention. She looked at the cases. They were arranged in a row before her, 4 of them, and she studied them with the letter still open in her lap. Each case had a number stamped on the latch plate in small, brass-colored digits. She found the list at the back of the letter and held it up. Case 1 held what Roy described as the core European issues. Case 2 held North American material, spanning roughly 1840 to 1940. Case 3 held what he called the exceptional items, a term he had circled twice and underlined once, and which he had followed with a brief note that read, "Do not open this case in anything other than clean, dry conditions, and handle the contents only with cotton gloves." He had written where she could acquire cotton gloves if she did not have them. He had written the name of a pharmacy 4 blocks from where she lived, as if he had looked it up. Case 4 held the documentation: provenance records, authentication certificates, acquisition histories, a correspondence between Voss and various dealers and auction specialists spanning 40 years. She set the letter down and sat for another long moment. Then she stood up, went to the kitchen, washed her hands, and came back. It was not cotton gloves, but it was the cleanest she could make them on a Wednesday night in December, and Roy would have understood. She opened Case 1. The interior was lined with custom-cut foam, the kind that cradles each item individually, shaped to its contours. The stamps were mounted on archival backing boards, each in a protective sleeve, each sleeve labeled in a handwriting she did not recognize, which must have been Voss's. The labels were precise and technical, with terms she could not yet decode. Country designations, year ranges, condition codes. But even without knowing what the labels said, and she understood something about what she was looking at. The colors alone told her. Not vivid, not the bright primary assertion of ordinary postage, but the particular subtlety of old ink on old paper, the kind of color that has been refining itself for 150 years. Blues that had deepened like water under clouds, reds that had faded toward something richer, blacks that held their edge against white paper that had gone to the warm tone of aged cream. Each piece was small. Most were the size of her thumbnail, and each one had been placed in its sleeve with the exactness of something that mattered. She counted the mounted boards in the first case. 27. She closed the case carefully and set it aside. She opened Case 2. More sleeves, more boards, on more of the quiet insistence of old paper that had survived longer than anyone who had handled it when it was new. These were different in character from the first case, the printing styles distinct in ways she was beginning to intuitively sense, even without the vocabulary to describe them. Bolder designs, the clear graphic confidence of a newer nation asserting itself. She found, near the middle of the case, a board with a single stamp mounted at its center, alone, with more space given to it than to any other item she had seen. She leaned closer to look at it without touching. It was not remarkable to look at. Not in any way she could have explained to someone who had not been sitting on a bedroom floor for the last 40 minutes with a letter from a dead man in her lap. It was red and small, and printed with a design that was ordinary enough, a numeral and a border and a faint impression of something official. But the space around it told her something. The way Roy had described Case 2 in his list told her something. The particular care with which this single item had been centered on its board told her something. She closed Case 2. She did not open Case 3 that night. She was not afraid of it exactly. She was applying Roy's instruction. He had written clean, dry conditions, and the bedroom was as clean as she could make it at midnight on a Wednesday. But she wanted to think carefully before she opened the case he had circled twice and underlined once. She wanted to be rested and present and clear-headed. She wanted, she realized, to not be alone when she opened it. She looked at the clock. It was nearly 1 in the morning. She opened Case 4 instead, the documentation, and she stayed up until 3 reading through it. What she found in Case 4 was the architecture of a collection. Voss had been meticulous in ways that went beyond careful. Every acquisition was documented from origin. There were letters between Voss and dealers in London, in Paris, in Tokyo, in Berlin. There were auction records with the lots circled and the prices noted in the margin in Voss's handwriting, beside which Roy had occasionally added a note in his own. There were certificates of authenticity issued by philatelic organizations. She looked up on her phone as she encountered them, organizations with institutional addresses and established histories, the kind of bodies whose endorsements meant something specific and provable. She found, out near the back of the documentation case, a folder labeled, simply, Valuations. Inside were 3 independent appraisal documents, each from a different specialist firm, each dated in the early 2000s. The most recent was from 2003, 3 years before Voss's death. The total figure at the bottom of the 2003 appraisal made her set the document down on the floor and look at the wall. She picked it up again and read it again. The number was the same. She thought about the gap between 2003 and now, more than 20 years. She thought about what Roy had written, that certain categories had only become more valuable. She thought about Case 3, which she had not opened, and the note beside it in Roy's list, and the way the documentation folder contained a separate subfolder for Case 3 alone, thicker than the others. Its contents, including correspondence she had skimmed but not yet read carefully. Correspondence in which she had caught phrases like exceptional rarity and possibly unique example, and no known duplicate in current census. She sat on her bedroom floor at 3 in the morning, and she did not panic, which surprised her. She felt instead a profound and almost disorienting stillness, the kind that comes not from peace, but from scale. When something is large enough, it does not create chaos in the mind. It creates a kind of suspension. The numbers on the 2003 appraisal were large enough that she could not hold them steadily inside herself yet. They slid away from her comprehension and came back and slid away again. She put everything back carefully, exactly as she had found it, and she went to bed. She did not sleep. She called Deanna in the morning after the girls had left for school. She did not tell her everything. She told her enough to get to the part that mattered, which was that she needed someone she trusted to come with her to open the 3rd case, and that she needed to borrow a pair of cotton gloves, which Deanna happened to own because she used them for refinishing furniture. Deanna arrived 40 minutes later with the gloves and a bottle of orange juice, and the expression of someone who had been told very little, but had sensed a great deal. Nadine showed her the letter. She watched Deanna read it, watched the expression on her face change in the way that expressions change when the ground shifts beneath them. Deanna was not a woman who showed surprise easily. She had been a practical, grounded person for as long as Nadine had known her, the kind of friend who responded to hard news with a question about what needed to be done, rather than with declarations about how unfair things were. She finished the letter and set it down on the kitchen table and looked at Nadine. "Roy," she said. "Roy," Nadine agreed. "Your uncle who called for 12 minutes at a time." "That one." Deanna looked at the table for a moment. Then she said, "Show me." They went into the bedroom together and sat on the floor, and Nadine put on the cotton gloves, and she opened case 3. The foam inside was different from the other cases. Denser, darker, cut with greater precision. There were 6 mounted boards in this case, separated by additional layers of archival foam, each board in its own sealed compartment rather than simply stacked. Roy had engineered the interior of this case as if it were responsible for protecting something irreplaceable, which it was. She lifted the first board out and held it in both hands, and Deanna leaned forward to see. The stamp on the first board was British. She knew this only because the documentation folder had prepared her, because she had spent 2 hours in bed the previous night, not sleeping, and instead reading and rereading Roy's descriptions and the appraisal documents until her eyes ached. It was from 1840, which meant it was among the earliest adhesive postage stamps ever produced by any government in the world. It was an imperforate example of the penny black, the world's first adhesive postage stamp, in a condition that the 2003 appraisal described using phrases she had needed to look up. The certification documentation in the subfolder confirmed its authenticity through 3 separate examinations conducted by leading philatelic authorities across 2 countries. She set it down with extraordinary care and lifted the second board. The second item was what Roy's list identified as the case's most significant single piece. It was American, issued in 1868. An inverted center error on a high-denomination stamp, meaning the central vignette of the stamp had been printed upside down relative to its frame, the result of a printing sheet being accidentally fed through the press twice with the paper inverted. Errors of this kind were created in small numbers when the mistake was caught, which it usually was, and the surviving examples were known in the philatelic world the way certain paintings were known in the art world, by name, by census count, by the particular gravity that extreme rarity confers. The documentation for this single stamp occupied a third of the subfolder. There was correspondence in the folder from Voss to a dealer, dated 1994, that described the acquisition in terms so careful and deliberate that she could feel the effort it had taken him to maintain composure while writing it. There was a certification document from the Philatelic Foundation in New York. There was a letter from a curator at a national institution that she recognized, describing the stamp in terms that made clear the institution would have been very interested in acquiring it. She set it down. She looked at Deanna. So Deanna had not said anything for several minutes. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor, with her hands on her knees, and an expression on her face that Nadine had never seen there before, which was the expression of someone in the presence of something they could not immediately categorize. "How much?" Deanna said. "I don't know exactly," Nadine said. "The 2003 appraisal is the most recent thing in the documentation." "What did it say?" Nadine told her. Deanna looked at the cases, then at Nadine, then at the cases again. She opened her mouth and closed it. "That was 2003, she said finally. 20-plus years ago. Things like this." Deanna gestured at the boards, the cases, the meticulously preserved evidence of 40 years of one man's obsession. "Do they go up in value over time?" "I don't know," Nadine said. "It's like I need someone who does." Deanna nodded slowly. You need an expert. I need an expert. Roy left you names. He did? Then that's where you start. She did not tell her brother yet. She was not ready for the conversation, because the conversation would require her to know something more definitive than what she currently knew, and because she was aware that the moment Kevin and Patricia understood what was in the cabinet, the conversation would change in character. It would become about fairness and history and Kevin's 2 hospital trips and a dozen other things that had nothing to do with what Roy had intended or what the collection actually was. She would tell them. She intended to tell them. But she would tell them when she understood what she had. She started with the documentation. She spent 3 full evenings going through the case 4-folder more carefully, building a picture of what Voss had assembled and in what sequence. She made notes. She made a list of the specific items and what she understood about each of them based on the records. She looked up every organization named in the authentication documents to confirm they were what they claimed to be. She looked up the auction house Roy had mentioned in his letter, a firm in New York with a long history in philatelic sales. It existed. It was still operating. Its website was low-key and institutional in the manner of organizations that did not need to advertise, because the people who needed them already knew where to find them. She called on a Thursday morning from her kitchen table, with her notes spread before her and the cases arranged in a row on the floor of the bedroom down the hall, and a cup of coffee that had gone cold while she was gathering the nerve to dial. The woman who answered connected her to a specialist named David Chiang after she explained, briefly and carefully, what she had. She had practiced what to say. She did not claim to know what she had. She described it as an inherited philatelic collection with documentation suggesting significant historical items, and she said she was seeking a preliminary consultation to understand whether a formal appraisal was appropriate. David Chiang listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked her 2 questions. The first was about the nature of the documentation. The second was specific. He asked if any of the items were from the 1868 American High Denomination series. She paused before answering, aware of the pause, aware of what it meant that he had asked that particular question. "There is something in that category in the collection," she said. There was a brief silence on his end. "When would you be available for me to come to you?" he asked. David Chiang arrived on a Tuesday morning 2 weeks later. He was a slight man in his early 60s, with wire-rimmed glasses and the unhurried manner of someone whose entire professional life had been organized around looking at small things carefully. He had flown from New York and was returning the same evening on a late flight, which told her something about the efficiency of his schedule, and also, she thought, about his assessment of how worthwhile the trip might be. He brought nothing with him except a leather bag that held his own tools, cotton gloves, a loop, a small ultraviolet lamp, several reference catalogs, and a digital camera with a macro lens. He set these on the kitchen table while she made coffee, and then he sat down and waited for her to bring him the cases. He went through the documentation first, which she respected. He did not reach for the stamps immediately. He read through the case 4-folder with the steady attention of someone who had been reading documents like these for decades, his expression neutral, his hand still, occasionally pausing to note something in a small notebook he had taken from the leather bag. He spent 30 minutes with the documentation alone. Then she brought him case 1. He worked slowly, handling each board with the natural ease of long practice, the cotton gloves a reflex rather than a procedure. He examined each item through the loop, tilted each board under the light at multiple angles, made notes. He did not comment as he worked. He was not a man, she could see, who offered preliminary observations. He was building toward something, and she sat at the other end of the table and let him build. Case 2 took longer. He paused over the single stamp on its isolated board for several minutes, setting it down and then returning to it twice. He checked the documentation for that item specifically, cross-referencing something in one of the catalogs he had brought. He took several photographs. He made more notes. When she brought him case 3, he sat up slightly. The shift was subtle, barely perceptible, a small adjustment in posture, but she had been watching carefully and she noticed it. He put on fresh gloves, which he had not done between the other cases. Then he opened the case. He worked through the first 5 boards methodically, and then he reached the 6th and the last, and she watched his face. His expression did not change. He was practiced at that, she understood. But his hand slowed. He held the board for a longer time than he had held any of the others. He took the loop and bent over it. He turned the lamp on it from 2 different angles. He set it down and went back to the documentation folder and found the specific section for case 3 and read through it with the focused attention of someone checking a source they already know to be accurate, but need to confirm anyway. He set the documentation down. He set the board down. He sat back in his chair and looked at the wall above the kitchen window for a moment, in the way that people look at nothing when they are organizing something inside themselves. Then he looked at Nadine. "How long have you had these?" he asked. "About 3 weeks," she said. "My uncle left them to me." "And before your uncle?" "They belonged to a man named Arthur Voss. He died in 2006. Chiang nodded slowly. "I know that name," he said, which she had expected he might. He was considered a serious collector. Significant, but private. He disappeared from the circuit in the 90s, and there was speculation that he had either shifted to entirely private acquisition or had retired from active collecting. I never saw his collection. "Nobody did, apparently," Nadine said. "So, except Roy." Chiang looked at the cases. He looked at the documentation folder. He looked at the last board from case 3, which he had set at a slight distance from the others, as if giving it space. "I would need to take these for formal examination," he said. "With your permission. The full authentication process takes time. There are specific organizations, protocols, reference databases. I cannot give you a final figure today." "I understand," she said. "But I can give you a preliminary assessment," he said. "Based on what I have seen this morning, and the documentation you have, and my own experience with material of this type." He paused. "This is a significant collection. I want to be clear about what significant means in this context." She nodded. "The material in case 1 is excellent. Well documented, well preserved, a representative of serious collecting over a long period. Based on current market, the items I have seen there range from several thousand to perhaps $50,000 individually, with the total content of that case likely in the range of $1 to $2 million. She kept her hands flat on the table. Case 2 is more complex. The isolated item on the central board is, assuming authentication confirms what the documentation suggests, a piece I would need to research specifically. But my preliminary view is that it is genuine, and that the current market value for a stamp of that specific issue in that condition could be in the range of $800,000 to $1.2 million for that single item alone. The radiator clicked. Outside, a car passed on the street. "Case 3, Chiang said, and he paused again in the way he had paused before, a structural pause, not a hesitation. "The first 5 items are exceptional. I would want to examine each of them formally, but provisionally I would expect each to represent a value between $500,000 and several $1,000,000. She was very still. "The 6th item," he said, "is the reason I came today." He looked at the board. "If it is what the documentation says it is, and what my examination this morning suggests it is, then you have something that the philatelic world has believed was either destroyed or permanently in private hands, lost to the market for decades." He named what it was, using technical language she had read in the documentation, and now heard spoken aloud for the first time by someone who understood it. There are fewer than 100 examples of the stamp class known to exist, he said. In the condition and variety you have here, the census narrows considerably. The last comparable example to sell at public auction sold in 2014 for $14 million. The market since then, for unique or near-unique examples in documented condition, has moved substantially. My preliminary estimate for this single item, pending formal authentication, is in the range of $20 to $30 million. Nadine looked at the table, then at the cases, then at David Chiang. Pending formal authentication, she said. Yes, he said. And the collection as a whole. He picked up his pen and looked at his notes for a moment. Including the documentation value, the provenance, the condition of the material, and current market conditions for comparable items, he said. My preliminary, non-binding estimate for the total collection is in the range of $280 to $330 million. She heard the words. She felt them land in the room. She looked at her kitchen, the old coffee maker, the calendar on the wall that still had last month's page because she had not gotten around to turning it, the bill from the electric company folded under the edge of the fruit bowl, the drawer where she kept the envelopes with money set aside for specific purposes, the $60 she had saved for the locksmith who had never been needed. She thought about the parking lot below the apartment window, the shopping cart at the fence, the truck with the broken tail light. She thought about her daughters, on to sleep in their beds when she had found the key. She thought about the 4 days a week at the hotel. She thought about the loan she had taken from Deanna that she had not yet fully repaid. She thought about her grandmother's jewelry, sold on a cold afternoon for money she had needed and never gotten back. She thought about Roy, who had sat with this knowledge for 18 years and had chosen her, who had believed, from a distance of 90 miles and 12-minute phone calls, that she would know what to do with it. She exhaled. She said, "What do we do next?" Chiang picked up his notebook and uncapped his pen. "We start the authentication process," he said, "and we do it correctly, which means carefully, which means it will take time." He paused. "Are you prepared for that?" "I've been figuring things out my entire life," she said. I can wait for this one to be done right." He looked at her over his glasses with the expression of someone who had met many people in difficult circumstances and had developed a reliable sense of which ones would be standing at the end. "Good," he said simply. He took out an inventory form and began, item by item, the formal process of turning what was in the cases into what was in the record. She sat across from him and watched him work, and through the window of the kitchen, the winter light came in at its flat angle and caught the dust in the air and made it visible and then moved on. And somewhere down the hall, the girls would be waking up soon, and the day was beginning again, and everything was the same as it had been yesterday, in every way that could be seen from the outside, and entirely different in every way that mattered. The authentication process began that same week. Chiang handled the logistics from New York, coordinating with the Philatelic Foundation and 2 independent specialist examiners, whose names she now knew and whose credentials she had verified with the systematic focus she usually applied to lease agreements and insurance paperwork. She had already learned that this world operated on the currency of provenance, which meant documented history, which meant the paper trail in case 4 was not incidental. It was foundational. Without it, even a genuine item existed in a kind of evidentiary limbo, its authenticity subject to perpetual challenge. With it, each piece carried its own argument. She surrendered the cases to a secure courier service on a Friday morning, to standing in the hallway of her apartment building with the cases in a padded transport bag that Chiang had sent, watching the courier sign for them on an electronic device. She had photographed everything before it left. She had a copy of every document in case 4. She had signed an agreement with the firm that specified exactly what would be examined and returned. She had also consulted with an attorney, a different one from the Crestford lawyer, someone Deanna's brother recommended, who practiced in the area of personal property and estates, and who had reviewed Roy's letter and the documentation and given her an opinion she trusted. She was doing this correctly. Roy had told her to do it correctly. She could hear him in the instruction, the same care he had given to 12-minute phone calls, sent to Christmas cards, with notes that were slightly too formal, to a filing cabinet organized with the precision of a man who understood that the things you protected needed to be worth protecting. The formal appraisal took 11 weeks. Those weeks were quiet on the surface and turbulent underneath, the way river water looks smooth from a distance and runs hard beneath. She went to work at the hotel. She drove the girls to their things, Maya to her theater rehearsals, Cecily to the Saturday art class she had attended for 2 years, which cost $40 a month, and which Nadine had never once considered canceling, despite the months when $40 was not a trivial amount. She paid her bills in the order of urgency. She returned Deanna's loan, in full, in cash, in an envelope she handed over without ceremony, and she was grateful that Deanna received it the same way, without theater, because anything else would have made her feel smaller than she could bear. She did not tell Kevin. The decision to wait felt precarious sometimes, like a rock balanced on an edge. But she held it. The time was not right. The right time was when she had something definitive, something documented, something that could not be disputed or minimized or redirected by a conversation about who had driven Roy to the hospital. She told Maya. She had to. Maya was 15 and observant, and had been watching her mother with an attention that had grown more focused since the filing cabinet arrived, and Nadine had learned long ago that trying to maintain a secret from Maya was like trying to keep a window dark in daylight. She sat her down one evening after Cecily was asleep and told her, carefully, what she knew, which was that Roy had left them something that might turn out to be significant, and that they were waiting to find out exactly how significant, and that until they knew they needed to behave as though nothing had changed, because nothing had changed yet. Maya had listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When Nadine finished, she sat for a moment, and then she said, "Great Uncle Roy, the one who called on birthdays." "That one," Nadine said. "He did all that," Maya said. "He did all that." Maya looked at the wall, working through something. And nobody knew. Not a soul. Because he was waiting to see who should have it. It had not occurred to Nadine to frame it exactly that way, and the directness of it surprised her. "Maybe," she said. "That's not maybe," Maya said, with the particular confidence of someone who had read the letter carefully over her mother's shoulder when she thought Nadine was not watching. "He said it straight out. He chose you." Nadine looked at her daughter, at the 15-year-old seriousness of her face and the older-than-15-year-old accuracy of what she had just said, and she felt the particular form of pride that does not announce itself, that settles instead like warmth along the back of the throat. "Yes," she said. "He chose me." Maya nodded once, in the way that marked a conclusion. "Okay," she said. "I won't say anything." She did not say anything. The authentication results arrived on a Thursday in early March, delivered as a formal report from the Philatelic Foundation, copied to Chiang, copied to her attorney, and emailed to her directly. She opened the email at the kitchen table on a morning when the girls were at school and the apartment was quiet. She had a cup of tea. She read the report in full before she allowed herself to process any single part of it. Every item in cases 1 and 2 was authenticated. The isolated stamp on the central board of Case 2 was confirmed as genuine, a documented rarity in the census of known examples, its authentication supported by physical examination, chemical analysis, comparative study against reference collections, and the provenance record in Case 4. Every item in Case 3 was authenticated. The 5 primary boards were confirmed as genuine, exceptional, and in conditions that placed them in the top tier of known examples for their respective categories. The values assigned in the formal appraisal exceeded Chiang's preliminary estimates for 3 of the 5 items. The 6th item, the last board from Case 3, the one Chiang had placed at a slight distance from the others, was confirmed as genuine, unique, in the current census of known examples in its specific variety and condition, and supported by provenance documentation of the depth and quality that the Foundation had not seen in a private collection in recent years. The formal appraisal figure for the complete collection, as documented in the final report, was $305 million. She sat with that figure at her kitchen table and drank her tea. $305 million. The number did not feel like a number. It felt like a statement in a language she was still learning to read. She had spent her entire adult life working the arithmetic of not quite enough, adjusting and managing and finding ways to make the month's numbers behave. She had internalized scarcity the way you internalize a language you grew up speaking, until it became not a hardship, but simply the grammar of your life. $305 million did not fit that grammar. It was a sentence in a different language entirely. She thought about Roy, who had kept this locked in a filing cabinet in a house in Crestford for 18 years, who had lived on what the checking account balance showed, modest and careful and alone, while a fortune sat in the corner of his study behind a raincoat. She had not understood, until this moment, what kind of man it took to do that. What discipline it required to hold that weight without letting it reshape the surface of your life. He had decided the collection was not his to spend. He had decided it was a custodianship. And he had kept it faithfully, with the same reliability he had given to 12-minute phone calls and carefully worded Christmas cards, until he could pass it on. She set down the tea, and she sat there for a while in the quiet of the apartment, with the authentication report on the screen in front of her and the winter light coming through the kitchen window, and she let herself stay in it, not celebrating, not planning, just inhabiting the moment of knowing, which was its own thing entirely, separate from what came next. She thought about the locked drawer. She thought about the key behind the right side panel, one hidden in plain sight inside a notation in a spiral notebook that she had found because she read carefully. She thought about the $60 in the envelope on the counter, saved for a locksmith who had never been needed. She thought about the parking lot. She got up and went to the window and looked out at it. The truck with the broken tail light was still there. The shopping cart was still at the fence. The lot looked exactly as it always had. She went back to the table and picked up her phone. She called Deanna first. Not Kevin, not the attorney, not Chiang. Deanna, who had come over with orange juice and cotton gloves on a cold morning and sat on the bedroom floor without asking too many questions, who had been the first other person to sit in the presence of what Roy had left. When Deanna answered, Nadine told her the number. There was a long silence. "Say it again," Deanna said. She said it again. Another silence. And then Deanna said, in a voice that had dropped to almost nothing, "Roy." "Roy," Nadine said. They were quiet together for a moment, the way old friends can be quiet without it meaning anything other than that the moment is too large for immediate words. "What are you going to do?" Deanna asked finally. Nadine looked at the authentication report on her screen, at the figure at the bottom of the final page, at the name of the collection, which Chiang had suggested they establish formally, which she had agreed to, and which would be known as the Voss Burrell Collection in the records of the auction house and the philatelic institutions and wherever else it would eventually be documented. "I'm going to call my brother," she said, "and then I'm going to call the girls' school and tell them I need to pick them up early. And then," she said, I'm going to figure it out." She called Kevin that same afternoon. She had spent an hour after the call with Deanna preparing for it. Not rehearsing exactly, but organizing her thoughts the way you organize a room before a guest arrives, making sure everything was in its proper place before anyone else walked through the door. She wanted to be fair to Kevin. She also wanted to be clear. Fairness and clarity did not always travel together easily, but she had decided they would in this conversation, and she held to that. Kevin answered on the third ring with the slightly distracted tone of a man multitasking, which was his natural register for phone calls in the afternoon. She asked if he had a few minutes. He said, "Sure, hold on," and she heard the background noise of his workplace recede as he stepped somewhere quieter. She told him about the authentication report. She told him the number. The silence that followed was different from the silence she had heard from Deanna. Deanna's silence had been the silence of someone absorbing something enormous and processing it through the lens of a friendship that had survived difficult years and knew how to hold complicated things. Kevin's silence was different. It was the silence of someone recalculating, and she could almost hear the arithmetic happening. $305 million, Kevin said finally. "That's the formal appraisal figure," she said. "The auction process may return more or less, depending on how the sale is structured and the market at the time. But that's the authenticated value." "In a filing cabinet," Kevin said. "In a filing cabinet," she confirmed. Another silence. "Roy," he said, and his voice had shifted into something quieter, something she recognized as genuine, stripped of the calculations that had briefly occupied it. "I drove him to the hospital twice. He never said a word." "He didn't say a word to anyone," she said. "For 18 years. She heard Kevin exhale. "I didn't think there was anything in it," he said. "The cabinet? I thought it was just more papers." "Most people did," she said. She did not say, "including Patricia." She did not say, "including Marcus and his poor man's logic." She did not say, "including yourself when you made the joke about the $300 truck for a $200 cabinet." She had decided before the call that she was not going to use this moment as a corrective. It was not that kind of moment. It was bigger than that, and smaller things did not deserve the space. "What are you going to do with it?" Kevin asked. "The auction house has a process. Chiang is guiding me through it. My attorney is handling the estate side to make sure everything is clean." She paused. "I want to talk to you about making sure you and Patricia are taken care of, Kevin. You were there for Roy in ways I wasn't able to be. That matters." The silence that followed this was different again. Softer. "Nadine," he said, "you don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she said. "That's why I'm doing it." He was quiet for a moment. She could hear him breathing, and she thought about the two of them as children in their mother's kitchen. A Kevin 4 years older, and generally convinced he knew more than she did about most things, which was often true and occasionally not true at all, and how the distance of adulthood had flattened that dynamic into something more equal, more honest, more like what they actually were to each other, which was simply two people who had come from the same place and were doing their best. "She's going to feel terrible," he said. He meant Patricia. "She doesn't need to," Nadine said. Nobody knew. There was no reason to know. "She said things," Kevin said, "about the cabinet, about it probably being nothing." "Everybody said things," Nadine said. "Everybody thought it was nothing. She told Marcus you were moving a worthless piece of furniture across the state because you were too stubborn to leave it." Nadine smiled, just slightly, pined to herself. She wasn't entirely wrong about the stubborn part. Kevin laughed, a short and genuine sound. "No," he said. "She wasn't." They talked for another 20 minutes, and by the end of it, the call had become what she had hoped it would be, a conversation between two people who were figuring out something together rather than negotiating against each other. She felt the rightness of it when she hung up. Not triumph, just resolution. The particular satisfaction of a door closing properly in its frame. Patricia called the next morning. Nadine had expected this. Patricia was not a person who processed things at a remove. She processed them by speaking, and when she spoke to Nadine, it was with an energy that was clearly effortful, on the effort of someone consciously managing an impulse towards something and redirecting it towards something else. "Kevin told me," she said. "I know," Nadine said. "I asked him to." A brief pause. "I said some things," Patricia said. "About the cabinet, about it not being worth moving. You weren't the only one. I told Kevin you were being impractical, that you were spending time and money on something that wasn't going to amount to anything." "You didn't know what was in it," Nadine said. "None of us did." "I was condescending," Patricia said, which was a word Nadine had not expected from her, and which landed with the particular weight of self-awareness, arriving somewhere late, but arriving nonetheless. "I acted like I understood the situation better than you did, and I didn't." Nadine held the phone and looked at the window. The morning light had come in clean today, which happened sometimes in winter, the sky going to a particular sharp blue that made everything visible without warmth. "Patricia," she said, "you were working with the information you had. So was everybody else." Roy had that collection hidden for 18 years. He didn't exactly leave a trail of clues. "He left it to you," Patricia said. "He did." Another pause. "Why you?" she asked. And it was not an accusation. It was a genuine question, the kind that came from someone who had been genuinely surprised. Nadine thought about the letter, about the 3 pages in Roy's small, careful handwriting, about the sentence that had made her sit on the edge of the bed for a long time on a Wednesday night in December. She thought about what it meant to be chosen by someone who watched quietly and said little and formed his opinions over years rather than moments. "Because he believed I would figure it out," she said. "He said so, in a letter he wrote to my father a long time ago. He believed that about me for a long time before I knew it." Patricia was quiet. When she spoke again, her voice had changed in a way that Nadine could not quite name, something that sounded like the release of a tension that had been held for a while. "He was right," Patricia said. "I'm starting to think so," Nadine said. She picked the girls up early from school that Thursday, as she had told Deanna she would. She signed them out at the front office, and they came out into the hallway, looking concerned, in the way children look concerned when a parent appears unexpectedly during school hours, scanning her face for the nature of the news. She took them to the diner 3 blocks from the school, the one they went to for birthdays, and report cards, and the occasional Friday when the week had been hard, and something warm and ordinary felt necessary. They slid into the corner booth, Maya and Cecily on one side, Nadine on the other, and the waitress brought them menus they didn't need, because they always ordered the same things. She waited until the food came. She had learned that significant conversations were easier when your hands had something to do. Then she told them. She told them about Roy, about the filing cabinet, about the key behind the panel, about the cases and what was in them, about David Chiang and the 11 weeks of authentication and the report she had read at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning 3 days ago. She told them the number. Cecily, who was 11, and approached most information with a straightforward directness that Nadine had always found both exhausting and admirable, said, $305 million. Yes. From stamps. From stamps. Cecily picked up her grilled cheese and took a bite, and appeared to be working through the information with the same focused attention she gave to math problems, which was the closest she came to reverence for anything. "Uncle Roy collected stamps," she said. "Roy didn't collect them. He kept them safe for someone who did." "For us," Cecily said. "For us," Nadine agreed. "For you, specifically. For your futures." Cecily chewed thoughtfully. Across the table, Maya was very still, her soup untouched, her eyes on her mother with the particular expression she had inherited from Nadine's father, the one that appeared when she was feeling something too large for her face to hold easily. "The cabinet," Maya said. "The one you brought home in Marcus's truck. That one. The one everybody said was worthless." Nadine nodded. Maya looked at the table. Then she looked up. Her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with tears, or not only tears. "I never thought it was worthless," she said. "I don't know why, but I didn't. When you brought it home, I looked at it and I thought, Mom knows something." Nadine felt something catch in her chest, clean and sharp and warm. "I didn't know anything yet," she said honestly. "I just wasn't ready to stop looking." Maya nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she had already understood. "That's the same thing," she said. They sat in the corner booth of the diner for a long time after the food was cleared, talking in the unhurried way of people who have been given, without warning, the gift of time. They talked about what the money might mean, carefully, without letting the conversation run ahead of what was real and confirmed. Nadine had learned from Roy, from the letter, and from the example of how he had lived, that holding something carefully was not the same as not holding it at all. She held this carefully with her daughters, in a diner booth on a Thursday afternoon, and it was enough. Cecily asked if they could get a dog. Nadine said yes. The auction was scheduled for late spring, on 6 months after the authentication was completed. The timeline was Chiang's recommendation, and she followed it. He explained that a sale of this magnitude required preparation, that the right market conditions and the right buyer pool had to align, that rushing would cost them far more than waiting would. She understood the logic, and she trusted the logic, and she was, in any case, not in the kind of desperation that required rushing. The gap between her earnings and her expenses was still present, but she had spoken to her attorney about a modest advance arrangement against the confirmed collection value, enough to stabilize the immediate pressure without touching the principal, and it had been structured cleanly and simply. She paid the electric bill on time for the first time in 7 months. She restored the hours at the hotel to full time and then gave notice, not angrily, not dramatically, not with any of the theatrical exits she had occasionally imagined on difficult shifts when the cart was heavy and the floors were long. She thanked her supervisor, who had been decent to her, and she worked the full 2 weeks with the same attention she had given to every shift before it. She was not yet wealthy. She was becoming wealthy. The difference mattered to her. She had not changed between the Thursday morning with the authentication report and the Thursday morning she gave her notice. The same person was doing both things. She enrolled Cecily in an additional art class. She took Maya to look at summer theater programs, one of which had been beyond reach for the past 3 years. And she watched her daughter walk through the building with the focused attention of someone assessing a place where she might actually belong. She slept better. This surprised her more than almost anything else. She had not realized how much of her sleep had been occupied by the low, persistent hum of financial anxiety until the hum stopped. She had thought she was simply a person who did not sleep well. It turned out she was a person who had been carrying a weight she had adjusted to over so many years that she had stopped noticing it as weight and had come to think of it as just the ordinary density of being herself. She noticed its absence. She was grateful for it. Word spread the way word spreads in families and neighbor networks and the social geography of people who share contexts. Not through her, she was careful about that, but through Kevin, who told Patricia, who was constitutionally unable to hold remarkable information entirely private, though to her credit, she was discreet about the details and consistent in her telling of them. Through Marcus, who had lent the truck and had made the poor man's logic joke, and who called Nadine directly one evening to say, without preamble, that he owed her an apology. "You don't," she said. "I do," he said. "I watched you load that cabinet, and I thought you were wasting your time. I said so to Kevin. You didn't know what was in it." "No," he said. "But I should have trusted that you knew what you were doing." She thought about that after the call. She thought about what it meant to trust someone's judgment without requiring evidence of it first. Roy had done that. He had done it over decades of distance, on watching from 90 miles away through phone calls and Christmas cards, and he had formed a conclusion about her that he had never shared with her directly, but had encoded in a letter to her father and a locked drawer in an olive green filing cabinet. He had trusted her judgment before she had access to the thing that would require it. That was the version of faith she had been given, the retroactive kind, the kind that said, "I believed in your capacity before you had the chance to prove it here." And there was something about that form of faith, she thought, that was more sustaining than the kind offered in full view. It could not have been influenced by wanting to please her. It was simply true. She let Marcus off the hook without ceremony and meant it entirely. The day she brought the filing cabinet to Roy's house, for she had not imagined that 9 months later she would be standing in a room at an auction house in New York, watching a man in a dark suit describe to a room of serious, well-dressed people the collection that had lived in the corner of her bedroom. She had not imagined the catalog with the Voss Burrell collection printed on its cover in simple, authoritative type. She had not imagined the quiet that descended over the room as the first item from Case 3 was displayed on the screen behind the podium, enlarged to a scale that revealed what was invisible to the naked eye. The extraordinary precision of the printing, the condition of the gum on its reverse, the particular clarity of its cancellation that confirmed a history of handling by people who understood exactly what they held. Maya was beside her, and she had wanted to bring both girls, but Cecily had school, and they had agreed, without much debate, that Maya would represent them both. Maya sat in the chair to Nadine's left with her back straight and her hands folded, and the expression she wore when she was concentrating very hard on not showing what she felt. Chiang was on Nadine's right. He had been through many auctions, and his manner reflected this, the calm familiarity of someone who watched markets the way a farmer watches weather, with respect and without surprise. The bidding started at a figure that would have seemed incomprehensible to her a year ago, and climbed from there with the measured, inexorable pace of serious money moving toward something it had decided it wanted. She had been prepared for this by Chiang, or who had described the dynamic in advance with the matter-of-fact clarity of a man who had learned that the most useful thing you could do for a first-time participant in a process like this was remove as much mystery from it as possible before it happened. There would be phone bidders. There would be bidders in the room. The auctioneer would work the increments with practiced ease. The pace would feel slow and then suddenly very fast. He had been accurate on every count. She did not watch the screen as the bidding went on. She watched the room. She watched the faces of the people in the chairs around her, the concentration in them, the specific quality of attention that came from being in the presence of something rare. She thought about Arthur Voss traveling to Europe twice a year, to Asia every third year, on pursuing these particular pieces across 4 decades. She thought about Roy keeping them safe for 18 years in a house on Meridian Street, behind a raincoat, in a locked drawer, behind a hidden key. She thought about how much intention had accumulated in these cases, how many decisions, by how many people across. How many years had converged in this room on this particular morning? She thought about the parking lot, the shopping cart at the fence. The gavel came down. The room shifted in the particular way rooms shift when something significant has concluded, a collective exhale, a release of held attention. Around her she could hear the quiet movements of people in expensive clothes responding to a number that had exceeded expectations. Chiang looked at her. His expression was composed, but his eyes held something she recognized as satisfaction. The satisfaction of a professional whose judgment had been validated precisely. "That was the 6th board from Case 3, he said quietly. "I know," she said. "That single item," he said, "just sold for $31 million. Maya made a sound beside her, a single sharp breath quickly controlled. Nadine reached over and put her hand over her daughter's folded hands and pressed once, gently, and Maya pressed back. The auction continued through the morning and into the afternoon. Items from all 4 cases were offered in a sequence Chiang had organized for maximum impact. The collection presented not as a miscellany, but as the coherent body of work it was, one man's lifelong vision made material. By the time the final lot was closed, the total return from the Burrell collection had exceeded the formal appraisal value. The final figure was $319 million. She sat in the car outside the auction house in the early evening, the city going about itself in its loud, indifferent way all around them, and Maya was in the seat beside her, and neither of them spoke for a few minutes. The sky had gone to the orange and gray of a city sunset, the light layered and imprecise, and the people on the sidewalk outside moved with the particular focus of people who had somewhere to be. "We should call Cecily," Maya said eventually. "We should call Cecily," Nadine agreed. She dialed. Cecily answered on the first ring, which meant she had been holding the phone. When Nadine told her the number, she heard her younger daughter say very quietly, "Okay," as if she were confirming directions she already knew were correct. And then, after a pause, she said, "Can we get the dog this weekend?" And Nadine laughed, fully and suddenly, the kind of laugh that comes from the intersection of exhaustion and relief and love, the kind that doesn't give you any warning and doesn't need any. And Maya looked at her and started laughing too, and the city went on outside the windows, and the sky finished changing colors, and it was enough. She paid off the car loan first. She did this before anything else, sitting at the kitchen table with the account number and the payoff amount written on a piece of paper in front of her, because it was the debt that had followed her longest, and that she had come to think of as the representative of all the others, the way one object in a room can come to stand for everything difficult about that room. She paid it off on a Tuesday morning in June, and then she sat for a moment with the confirmation number on her screen and felt the specific sensation of a thing that had been leaning against you for years, finally stepping back. Then she paid the remaining balance on the apartment. She paid Deanna's loan a second time because she had paid it once and felt that a debt of friendship of that particular depth warranted a second accounting, and because Deanna had never made her feel small for needing it, which was worth more than the money itself. She paid for Maya's summer theater program. She paid for Cecily's art classes through the end of the following year, and then the year after that. She established educational funds for both of them that would handle their futures without condition or contingency. She did not describe them dramatically to her daughters. She mentioned them the way you mention that there is food in the house, as a practical fact, as the baseline of a life that was now organized differently. You will not have to worry about this. That was the sentence she wanted to build into the architecture of their lives, not as a promise she was making now, but as a condition she was removing. You will not have to carry this particular weight. She had carried it. She knew what it felt like and what it cost. She did not want them to know in the same way. She gave Kevin and Patricia enough to clear their mortgage and establish a fund for their son, who was 11 and already showing the single-minded interest in computers that suggested a particular kind of expensive future. She did this without making it a production, in a conversation at her kitchen table over coffee on a Sunday afternoon, stated plainly, and accepted the same way. Kevin looked at the table for a moment, and then looked at her and said, with the voice of a man who had been her brother for a long time. Roy was something else. He was, she said. He saw something in you. He saw what was there, she said. He just said it out loud before I did. Kevin nodded. That was enough. She found the apartment she had thought about only theoretically for the past 2 years. The way you think about things you believe you cannot have, turning them over occasionally just to confirm they remain out of reach. A house. Not large, not extravagant in any way that announced itself, but with a yard that had space for a dog to run, and a room for each of the girls, and a kitchen with windows that faced something other than a parking lot. She spent 3 weeks looking before she found it. She was not in a hurry. Having time was one of the things that had changed, and she was learning to use it without guilt. The day she brought Cecily to see the house for the first time, her daughter walked through each room with the systematic attention of someone conducting an inspection, pressing on walls, opening closet doors, peering into corners. When she came back to where Nadine was standing in the kitchen, she had the expression she wore when she had reached a conclusion. "The yard is good," Cecily said. "It is," Nadine agreed. "The dog will like the yard." "I think so." Cecily looked around the kitchen, at the windows, at the space that was just space right now, and would become something filled over time, with the ordinary accumulation of a life lived in it. "Roy never saw this," she said, not as a complaint, as an observation. "No," Nadine said. "He didn't. But he made it possible." Nadine looked at her daughter, at the 11-year-old directness of her, the uncomplicated way she arrived at truth. "He did," she said. Cecily nodded once. "We should remember that," she said. "Not like a sad thing, just like a true thing." Nadine thought about the small craftsman bungalow on Meridian Street, which was in the process of being sold, and the room where the filing cabinet had stood behind a raincoat, on the 3 pages of cream-colored paper with the small, careful handwriting, and the sentence that had lived in a letter for 14 years before she found it. She thought about Roy, who had driven a long distance in his mind from 12-minute phone calls to choosing her, who had crossed from the nearness of family to the intimacy of faith without making a sound. "You're right," she said to Cecily. "Not a sad thing, just a true thing." She bought the house 2 weeks later. The dog's name was Meridian. Maya had suggested it, and Cecily had approved it with the official gravity she brought to decisions that mattered. And Nadine had said yes, without hesitation, because it was the right name, and she knew it immediately, and some things you do not need to think about. He was large and brown, and moved through the new house with the confident, exploratory energy of an animal who had not read any of the paperwork, but had nonetheless decided the arrangement was acceptable. He ran in the yard every morning. Cecily ran with him. Maya photographed them both from the kitchen window, and occasionally from the yard itself, because she had decided that summer that she wanted to learn photography, a decision Nadine had supported by purchasing a camera that would have required 3 months of saving the previous year and now required an afternoon's errand. This was the new arithmetic, the new grammar. She was learning it as you learn a second language in adulthood, with effort and attention, and with the occasional disorientation of a person who still sometimes expected the old rules to apply. Deanna came for dinner once a week. They sat at the kitchen table the way they had always sat, in the comfortable shorthand of a friendship that had survived the kind of proximity that reveals people fully. And they talked about the same things they had always talked about, because the things worth talking about do not change with money. They talked about the girls, about the week just finished, about the things they were reading, and the things that had surprised them, and the things that had not. They drank the same kind of wine they had always drunk, though better now, and the difference was noticeable and modest and exactly appropriate. On one of those evenings, Deanna asked her what the hardest part had been. Not the hardest part of the discovery, or the auction, or the legal process, and the hardest part of becoming someone living a different life. Nadine thought about it for a long time before she answered. "Trusting it," she said finally. "Every time I made a decision, there was a part of me that was still calculating for the old version of things, still checking to see if I could afford it, still expecting something to change back." Deanna nodded. "Roy kept that collection for 18 years without touching it," Nadine said. "Without spending it, without selling it, without telling anyone, because he didn't think it was his to spend. He was keeping it for the right moment and the right person." She looked at her glass. "I think about that sometimes. What that kind of patience looks like. What it means to hold something carefully for a long time, for someone else, without knowing if they'll ever receive it." "He knew you would receive it," Deanna said. "Maybe," Nadine said. "Or maybe he just hoped, the way you hope when you love somebody." She looked out the kitchen window at the yard, where the outside light was on, and Meridian was moving through the grass with the unhurried purpose of an animal engaged in the evening's most important work. And the tree at the back fence was beginning to show the first signs of spring, small and tentative and sure. "He was right," Deanna said. "He was right," Nadine agreed. She returned to Crestford one last time, in April, before the sale of the house on Meridian Street was finalized. She went alone. She parked on the street and walked up the short concrete path past the garden bed that no one had yet tended, past the porch with its sagging corner, and she stood at the front door for a moment before she went in. The house was mostly empty now. The furniture had been dispersed, the boxes sorted and distributed. What remained was the structure itself, clean and plain, with the pale rectangles on the walls where pictures had hung, and the faint impressions on the carpet where the furniture had stood for 22 years. It smelled of old wood, and something very faintly sweet. Maybe cedar. Still, the way a place holds its own character longer than you would expect. She walked through each room slowly, her hands in her jacket pockets, not touching anything. She stood in the study where the filing cabinet had lived, hung in the corner behind where the raincoat hook had been. The corner was just a corner now. The wall was just a wall. There was nothing there that announced itself. Nothing that said, "Here is where it happened. Here is where a decision made across 18 years of silence made its way to the surface." She stood in the room for a while. She thought about what Cecily had said. Not a sad thing, just a true thing. She thought about the key, small and brass-colored in the palm of her hand on a Wednesday night in December. The way it had fit the lock without resistance, the way things fit when they belong exactly where you are putting them. She thought about the drawer sliding open, slow and deliberate and patient, the same way Roy had been patient, the same way the ground holds things that are meant to surface and keeps them until the moment is right. She thought about the parking lot with the shopping cart at the fence, and the truck with the broken tail light, and the 12-minute phone calls, and the letter written in small, careful handwriting to a man who had needed $3,000 and received it along with a sentence about his daughter that she had been living inside her whole life without knowing it was there. She thought about how a life can hold more than its visible surface suggests, how a man can live in a small craftsman bungalow on a quiet street and contain something extraordinary without it ever showing on his face or changing his voice when he called on birthdays. How the most important things are sometimes kept in the places nobody thinks to look. The locked drawer, the overlooked room, the short phone call from the person who says little and means much. She thought about her daughters in the house with the good yard, and the dog named Meridian, and the futures that were now organized differently, and she felt the weight of Roy's faith in her as something that had not ended when he did, but had in fact only fully begun when she found the key. She had always figured it out. He had known that long before she did. She left the house on Meridian Street for the last time and walked back down the concrete path and got in her car and drove home. The highway west was flat and pale in the April light, the fields beginning to show the first green of the season, tentative and real, and the sky was wide, and the road was familiar, and she drove with the windows down a little, because it was almost warm enough for that now, because spring was doing what spring does, which is to arrive whether you are prepared for it or not, and to change the color of everything without asking permission. She had $319 million and a dog named after a street in Crestford and 2 daughters who were becoming the people they were always going to be, and a kitchen with windows that faced something other than a parking lot. She had been chosen by a man who watched quietly and said little and believed in her from a distance of 90 miles and 12 minutes at a time. She had figured it out. She always had. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.